There is a workbench sitting in a museum in Paris that was designed by a French joiner in the 1760s. It has no electricity. It has no proprietary hardware. It has no quick release mechanism with a patented cam system and a customer service number printed on the box. It is wood held together with wood, with a few iron screws in the vices, and a well-worn top that has been flattened and reflattened so many times the marks of the plane overlap like tide lines on a harbor wall. Furniture makers who travel specifically to stand in front of it describe the experience the same way every time. They say it looks exactly right, not impressive, not complicated, right. As in the proportions are correct, the work holding makes immediate sense, and you can see in about 30 seconds how a craftsman would use every inch of it. Then they go home and look at the bench they paid $2,000 for, the one with the cast iron vise hardware, and the dog holes in a pattern copied from a magazine article, and some of them have a very uncomfortable afternoon. The 4 workbenches on this list were not designed by marketing committees. They were not optimized for a product page. They were worked out by people who spent their lives standing at a bench and eventually figured out exactly what a bench needed to be and, just as importantly, what it did not. Half of the names on this list you will know. The other half will be genuinely new to you, and the reason for that gap is the same reason it always is. Here is the thing about workbenches that the modern woodworking market prefers you figure out only after you have already spent the money. A workbench is a tool. It is the tool that holds the work while every other tool does its job, which means its only real obligations are mass, a flat surface, and reliable work holding. That is the complete list. Mass matters because a bench that moves when you plane against it is not a bench, it is an obstacle. And no amount of clever vise hardware fixes the problem of a bench that walks across the floor when you push a plane along a board edge. Flatness matters because every operation that references the bench surface, and more of them do than most beginners realize, is only as accurate as the surface it references from. A twisted bench top introduces error at every stage and disguises itself as a skill problem rather than a setup problem, which is one of the more expensive ways to spend time in a shop. Work holding matters because a piece of wood that shifts while you are sawing it or chiseling it is actively fighting you, and fighting the work is the fastest way to produce cuts that are imprecise, surfaces that need correction, and joints that close with gaps you cannot explain. Everything else, the finish on the apron, the decorative stretchers, the color of the vise hardware, the particular configuration of dog holes laid out in a precise grid, is either secondary or entirely cosmetic. The premium workbench market has spent considerable energy over the last 2 decades convincing buyers that the secondary and cosmetic details are actually primary, because secondary and cosmetic details are the things that photograph beautifully and justify a significant price increase over what the lumber and hardware actually cost. The result is a market full of beautiful benches that are genuinely pleasant to look at and occasionally quite good to work at, sold alongside a smaller number of benches that are extraordinary to work at and look like exactly what they are, which is a serious tool built for serious use. The 4 benches on this list belong to the second category. 3 of them you can build yourself in a weekend or a long week, depending on your pace. All 4 of them will outlast every other piece of furniture in the shop. One of them changed the entire conversation about what a workbench could be, and has been changing it continuously for 2.5 centuries. Number 4. The Nicholson Bench. Peter Nicholson was a Scottish architect and mathematician who published a woodworking manual in the early 19th century that contained, among other useful things, a description of a workbench so straightforward and so sensible that hand-tool woodworkers have been building versions of it for 200 years without feeling any particular need to improve on it. The Nicholson bench is essentially a platform with a thick front apron and a leg vise, built to be heavy through the use of construction lumber rather than expensive hardwood, with a surface that is wide enough to be useful and long enough to handle full-size panels and boards. What makes it remarkable is what it lacks. There is no tail vise. There is no complicated system of bench dogs in a specific pattern. There is no hardware that requires a specialty supplier to replace. The work holding happens at the front apron, which is flush with the benchtop surface, and thick enough to accept holdfasts and planing stops and clamps in any configuration the work requires. The entire bench can be built from dimensional lumber purchased at any home center for well under $200, and the result is a working surface that professional hand tool woodworkers use for production furniture without apology. The Nicholson is the bench that proves mass and geometry matter more than complexity and cost. It is also the bench that most people building their first serious shop bench walk right past, because it does not look impressive enough in a photograph to justify what they are about to spend on lumber. That instinct costs them money and gains them nothing. Number 3. The Holtzapfel Cabinet Maker's Bench. Charles Holt Zapfel was a London instrument maker and writer who published a multi-volume work on hand tool woodworking in the mid-19th century that remains one of the most technically detailed documents on the subject ever produced in the English language. Buried inside that work is a description of a cabinet maker's bench that represents the English tradition of furniture-making work-holding at its absolute peak. The Holtzapfel bench is different from its continental counterparts in ways that matter immediately when you start working at one. The primary work holding is a shoulder vise at the left end of the bench, a design that grips long boards edge up for planing without the leverage problems that afflict most other vise configurations when the board is tall and narrow. The surface is uninterrupted from end to end. No tail vise cutting into the right corner, no hardware protruding above the plane of the top. The result is a bench that handles the specific demands of furniture making, fitting joints, planing long edges, chopping mortises in thick stock with a cleanliness of operation that reflects 2 centuries of English cabinet-making practice distilled into a single design. Almost nobody in the American woodworking market knows this bench exists. Holtzapfel never became a household name in the United States. The volumes are not in print in any accessible edition, and the bench described inside them has never been the subject of the kind of magazine coverage that turns a design into a cultural reference point. What it has been is the quiet first choice of a certain kind of English-trained cabinet maker who knows the literature and builds accordingly, and who tends not to feel any urgency to explain the choice to anyone who has not already done the reading. Number 2. The Moravian Workbench. In the mid-18th century, a religious community of German immigrants called the Moravians settled in parts of North Carolina and Pennsylvania, and built communities organized around shared craft traditions. Their joiners and furniture makers worked at a bench that had been developed within that tradition over decades of continuous use, a design so different from the mainstream of European workbench history that when it was rediscovered and documented by researchers in the 20th century, serious woodworkers looked at it for a long time before they fully believed what they were seeing. The Moravian bench is low, lower than almost every other workbench in the Western tradition, built to allow the craftsman to use body weight over hand tools rather than relying on arm strength alone. The work holding is a single face vise at the left end, simple and direct, with no tail vise and no dog hole system anywhere on the top. The bench is also light by the standard of European benches, light enough to be moved by one person without help, which was a practical necessity in the community workshops where it was used. And then you watch someone plane at one. The low height lets the body drive the plane from the hips and core rather than the arms and shoulders, which is the mechanically correct way to push a hand plane through difficult grain, and the difference in control and efficiency is immediately visible even to someone watching from across the room. This bench was built by people who used it 8 hours a day for their entire working lives. Every proportion in it reflects that accumulated experience. It is not a design that looks impressive. It is a design that works correctly, which is a completely different standard and a considerably harder one to meet. This is a good moment to stop and say, if this kind of breakdown is useful to you, subscribe, because this channel is built around cutting through the noise and telling you what is actually worth your time and your shop space. And if you are already thinking about building one of these benches and want to know which design fits your work and your space before you buy a single board of lumber, I put a guide together that covers exactly that, and I will come back to it at the end. Number 1. The Roubaud Bench. André Jacob Roubaud was a French joiner who spent his working life in the Parisian furniture trade, and then sat down and documented everything he knew about it in a comprehensive manual of the woodworking trades published between 1769 and 1775 called L'Art du Menuisier, which translates to The Art of the Joiner. It is one of the most complete records of pre-industrial woodworking practice that exists anywhere. And the workbench described and illustrated in that work is the bench that every serious discussion of workbench design eventually circles back to. The Roubaud is massive. The top is typically 3 to 4 inches thick, laminated from hardwood, flat across its entire length, and heavy enough that the bench does not move when you work at it, regardless of what tool you are using or how aggressively you are using it. The work holding is a leg vise at the left end, a simple wooden construction that grips with enormous mechanical advantage and can be adjusted to any board thickness without tools. The tail vise, when included, is a wooden shoulder vise at the right end that works with a row of round dog holes in the top to clamp boards flat for face planing. The entire design exists in a state of resolved completeness that is almost unusual to encounter in any designed object. There is nothing in a well-built Roubaud that feels like a compromise or an afterthought. Every dimension is there for a reason that becomes clear the moment you start working. The leg vise grips where other vices twist. The thick top dampens vibration in a way a thin top cannot. The height is set for planing efficiency rather than for comfort, while standing still, which turns out to be the correct priority for a work surface that exists to support cutting operations rather than to be stood next to. The Roubaud became the bench that the contemporary hand tool revival returned to when it needed a foundation, because it is the bench that rewarded returning to. 2.5 centuries of use in professional French joinery shops, followed by another several decades of use in the workshops of the woodworkers who rediscovered it in the late 20th century, produced the same verdict every time. It is right, not because of tradition, because of geometry, mass, and an understanding of how a human body actually moves when it is using edge tools against wood with serious intent. That is a combination that does not go out of date. So what does all of this mean for you and the bench you are either working at right now or planning to build? It means the conversation you should be having is not about which vise hardware to buy or how many dog holes to drill or whether to use hard maple or beech for the top. Those are secondary decisions. The primary decision is whether your bench has enough mass to stay still, a flat enough surface to be trusted, and work holding that is simple enough to set up and release quickly without interrupting your concentration. A bench that does those 3 things at a modest price is a better bench than one that does them imperfectly at a high price. And the difference between a modest bench and an expensive one is almost never in the mass or the flatness or the work holding. It is almost always in the finish, the hardware, and the name on the plan. Before we close, I want to answer the question this kind of video always produces. People want to know whether they should buy a bench or build one, and they want to know which design to start with if they decide to build. The answer to the first question is almost always build, not because buying a bench is wrong, but because the process of building your bench is when you learn what a bench needs to do, and that knowledge changes how you use it for the rest of your time in the shop. The answer to the second question depends entirely on what kind of work you do, how much floor space you have, and whether your work is primarily face work and panel flattening or primarily edge work and joinery. Those variables point to different benches for different reasons, and the guide linked below works through exactly that decision in plain terms without assuming you already know which tradition you belong to. The link is in the description. These benches were designed by people who had no interest in impressing anyone. They had work to do, and they needed a surface to do it on. Everything in the designs that survived is there because it helped. Everything that would have gotten in the way was left out. That is a standard worth building toward.